Over the last couple of weeks, we've been interrogating the significance of what it means that in Jesus, God has come to dwell with his people. That's the central task of Advent, I think, actually, is to look at this and tell each other and ourselves again, why is it so significant that Jesus came to be with us? In John chapter 1, it says that God in Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, These are familiar words for us this time of year, but why is this so important, and why is it still worthy of our wonder? And so we've been tracing stories of close encounters with God, face-to-face encounters with God through the Old Testament. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at God in the garden with Adam and Eve and the intimacy, the up-close intimacy that we were created to have with God and how that was lost. And last week we looked at God on the mountain with Moses, and both of these stories tell us that intimacy, familiarity, a sense of God's presence is something that we both long for and something that we're unfit for. It's the root desire of our hearts. Every longing can trace itself to that longing, a desire for God and his glory, and something that we're unfit for. And we will see both of these things in this passage that we'll read this morning as we look at God in the temple in Isaiah chapter 6. I got to tell you, this is one of the most rich passages, I think. I mean, it is unbelievably rich and full. There is so much meaning packed into every single verse. And it bears far more meaning in it than I can unpack over the next few minutes. But please lean into this with me. Let's look together. This is Isaiah chapter 6. I'll read verses 1 through 8. Hear the word of the Lord. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. And I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And then I said, Here I am, send me. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let me pray. Lord, you have put on display for us in this passage the way of your salvation, the generosity of your grace, what Jesus came to do. And so I pray, would you stir us up with wonder again at all that this is and all that it means, what it means about your character, what it means about our security and rest in you, and the promises that come with baby Jesus as he arrives. And I ask all these things. Oh, and help me to speak with real love for these people and earnest love for you. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So it was one morning in 1955, residents of Berlin, Germany, woke up to find that a white line had been painted across their city. And that line was a line of demarcation. It was a dividing line. It was a do not cross line that divided the city in half. And to attempt to cross this line was to take your life into your own hands. And of course, if you're likely familiar with this, this is the story of the Berlin Wall that stood for 28 years in the city of Berlin. And you know that it was a lasting symbol on the world stage of a world that had grown cold. And you know that wall, that line didn't stay a line, but it was built up into a wall with concrete and concrete barriers and barbed wire and watchtowers and armed guards. And there was a lot of there was a lot of news, of course, about its international significance, but it bore tremendous significance to the residents of the city of Berlin at that time. It made for an incredibly difficult time for them. You see, previously, before that wide line had been drawn, that they were free to roam across. They were free to move across the entirety of the city. And then suddenly, families were divided up. Parents were divided from their grown children. You had, I heard about a picture of a grandmother who waved across the line at her grandkids that lived in an apartment behind them. If you had a business on the other side of that line, that was not your business anymore. Friendships were carved up. Everything was separated. Whole lives were carved up by that line that stood forever. And I learned recently that there were some that thought that wall would stand forever. It's not hard to imagine the grief that those people experienced at the time, because separation, division, estrangement even, always brings grief. Always bears a special kind of pain. Always is real difficulty. And I bet you can imagine their grief, and I would even suppose that you have experienced this grief in some way, or maybe you are right now. And I've had many tell me that this time of year is a time when we feel the distance between us and people we love, or from people that love us. Sometimes it's geographical distance. We just don't get to see these people often enough as we see them. Sometimes it's a distance created by past hurts that are unresolved. Sometimes it's the distance we feel when we look at the empty chair at the holiday table and we're reminded about a separation or a loss in our past. We feel the grief and the sadness. And the question we ask is, will there ever be a time when all this pain is healed, when what is broken is healed and what has been separated can be joined together again? And I would propose to you that when we look at this passage in Isaiah chapter 6, we see that God's answer is yes. He can undo what separates. You see, the Bible proposes that all the division, all the separation, and all the grief that comes with it has its roots in a separation that when our first parents separated themselves from God. And they were kicked out of the garden, and all of a sudden we see division and estrangement happen all through the story. They left the garden, they left God's presence, and then all of a sudden you see husband and wife, you see brother against brother, and later you see nation and nation. And the question, of course, as we read that story is it possible for what has been broken to be healed again, for what has been separated to be united again? And God's answer in this passage is yes, just watch me do it. As you see Isaiah come into God's presence and experiences all the reasons he's unfit to be there. And then you see God apply his remedy to Isaiah with the triumph of his redeeming grace. This is what we'll be talking about this morning. We're going to talk about Isaiah's dilemma and try to understand exactly what it is. Why is he so undone as he finds himself in God's presence in his throne room? And then we'll talk about the remedy of God's redeeming grace given to him. So Isaiah's dilemma and God's remedy. Let's look together. First, let's talk about this Isaiah's dilemma that he has here in this passage. It's a graphic passage. It's, of course, a vision, which most visions in the Bible are very, very graphic. They kind of provoke the imagination. That's why they're there. It's interesting that Isaiah had been going to the temple, likely for many, many years across the course of his life. And then he goes to the temple and he actually sees God in the temple as he goes. And when he does see God, he's completely undone. He says, "Woe is me, for I am lost." There's a sense of finality to it. Another way you could translate that is, "Woe is me, for I am ruined." I mean, he feels like whatever has brought him to this place. He's so unfit to be there that all is lost, that the consequences are just about to be experienced. They're imminent. What has him falling apart at the seams at this moment? Well, I want to say three things. First, he sees something unbelievably beautiful, and then he sees something unfamiliar, and then finally he sees himself. He sees something unbelievably beautiful, he sees something unfamiliar, and then finally he sees himself. First, something beautiful. What does he see? It's verse 1. It's in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Now you see this in a few places in Isaiah where he timestamps the passage across his ministry. You see that where people can kind of look and see, oh, this is when that happened. Everyone in Israel would have known the year that King Uzziah died. He was, I would venture to suppose that he was a beloved king because he was a king that brought unparalleled economic stability to the land. Israel was wealthy and had grown up under Uzziah's reign, but it was also an angsty time on the international stage for them because Assyria was on the rise and seemed like it had Israel in its sights, and now Israel's king had died. And so it created just a lot of anxiety about the future for those who were a part of Israel. And so see the beauty of this. In the year that King Uzziah died, what does Isaiah see but an undying king, raised and lifted up on his throne? And what he has a picture of is a picture of real royal, majestic beauty. You see the loveliness of his peace. It makes a note there. I see a king sitting on his throne. That's meant to communicate the peace of a king who has no anxiety about the future of his kingdom. A king who is in absolute control, whose power is perfectly protected. He's not scurrying around or worried about anything. That's what Isaiah is seeing on this passage. The loveliness of his peace. You also see the loveliness of his majesty. So he's high and lifted up. He is exalted on a throne. And then you see, this is curious, he's high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. In verse 1 is what it says. It's just wild. I've never worn anything with the train before. This is not something that we do very often. In fact, the closest example I could think of was, some of you might remember this. Some of you might be old enough to remember this, and I'm not calling you out. But if you remember in 1981 when Princess Diana married Prince Charles in St. Paul's Cathedral, of course it was a remarkably beautiful day, right? The royal family spared no expense. It was supposed to give a sense of overwhelming beauty and royal power, both at the same time. And Princess Diana, one of the things that people talked a lot about coming out of that day was the length of the train on her wedding gown. It was 25 feet long. In fact, there were all these stories about how difficult it was to manage at the time. She apparently needed to get into a glass coach to ride in it with her father to St. Paul's Cathedral, and they couldn't fit it all in, and they couldn't do it without damaging the train. And the whole idea was it was given to her because it marked her apart as a person of real significance, of a woman of dignity and beauty, and of course, a woman of majesty. And that's the sense that we have here in this passage, is that is communicating to us that the Lord reigns as a king with beauty and majesty, surrounded by majesty, and he's surrounded by unfamiliar creatures. These, no doubt, would have been these angelic beings that you see in this passage. No doubt Isaiah probably would never have seen these before. In fact, this is the only passage in the Bible where we get much of a real description of what a seraphim is in verse 2. The word seraphim means literally fiery ones. So as they're flying, you see they have 6 wings, they're flying. You can imagine, like flaming meteors, like moving around the presence of God. And there's significance behind the 6 wings that they have. It says that they have 2 wings that cover their feet, 2 wings that cover their face, and of course 2 wings on their back that they fly with. And most commentators agree about the significance of these wings. But most of the time, most of them agree that they cover their feet as a sign of modesty. They cover their feet as it's a way of saying, I am unworthy to be in the presence of such glory. There is no question in their minds that it is only by his grace that they belong there. The wings on their back show that they are ready to do his bidding. And the wings that cover their face gives us a sense that even though they love him, they love being around him, that they still can't behold his glory face to face. They have to cover their eyes. They can't look directly at him like you and I can't look directly at the sun. They can't look directly at him, but what can they do? They can do what we were doing earlier. They can sing. And what do they sing? They sing about his holiness. They say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Of course they're singing about his glory. Glory that they can barely behold. But of course they sing about his holiness. It's interesting. In Hebrew poetry, whenever the Hebrew poetry uses repetition in order to intensify the meaning of the word. And in the Bible, many, many things have been called holy. Moses met with God on a holy mountain. God says, be holy, for I am holy. In fact, in the New Testament, God looks at his people and calls them his holy ones. But never, ever, ever has anything been described as holy, holy, holy. God is the only one who that can be said of. And what is this pointing to? It's certainly pointing to his glory, but it is saying that he is morally perfect like no other. It is talking about his moral purity. And what is that? Well, it's a combination of all of the things that makes God who he is. That he's the pre-eternal one. That he's the creator. That he rules with power like nobody else rules with. But also that he's incredibly wise and caring and generous. And he's somebody of integrity. He keeps all the promises that he makes. There is no one like him in all the earth. They are setting him aside as the Holy One like no other. And so you see, this is unfamiliar for him. This is a combination of what is unfamiliar and incredibly beautiful for Isaiah. What does it do? It leaves him undone. And it leaves him undone because in the face of all of this perfection, he realizes his own imperfection, right? He sees himself. And we said this a couple weeks ago. It's worth bringing up again, but this is what Calvin would call, John Calvin, 16th century reformer, this is what he would call the roots of all wisdom. Is that the more we understand God, the better we're able to understand ourselves. The better we're able to understand ourselves, the better we're able to understand God. That knowledge of both of these things are reciprocating. They build each other up. In fact, this is what he said. He said, it is certain that man never achieves a clear knowledge of himself unless he has first looked upon God's face and then descends from contemplating God to scrutinizing himself. That's exactly what's going on here. This is why our worship service is structured the way it is. This is why we spend some time reading about God. We hear God's call to worship. We sing about who he is. And then what does that do? That moves us to confession. That's the flow of what we see here. Seeing God helps him see himself. Seeing God baldly in all of his glory helps him see himself. And he says, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips. You might ask, and I dwell in a land of people of unclean lips. And you might ask, and many people do, why does Isaiah, when he's undone and he's confessing his sin, why does he specifically mention his lips? And that's a really good question. And I'll tell you, there are a lot of different opinions about this. But I don't know. I think it's a combination of two. I'll give you two different ideas that I think are in play in this passage. Why he says, I am a man of unclean lips, and why the seraphim brings the coal and touches his lips. And the first thing I think is in play is that Isaiah is being commissioned as one of God's prophets. He's going to become God's mouthpiece. He's going to speak God's words to the people. And Isaiah is being made aware. He's learning just how unfit he is for that task. That's one part of it. But I don't think that's the whole part. Because the Bible talks a lot about how the quickest way to understand the truth of our sinful hearts is to examine what comes out of our mouths. And this is what Jesus says. Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. There's a passage where the Bible indicts those whose throats are open sepulchres. I mean, it's the idea that out of the mouth, the heart speaks, and it gives us a true revelation of the fitness of our own heart. So it's not just that Isaiah feels unfit to do the job that God is calling him to, but he's just fully aware of how deeply unfit he is to be in God's presence. How these two things can't coexist. Let me ask you something. Do you want to know what's really going on inside? Examine what comes out. Audit the words that you use. Really consider that. And if you do honestly, I think what you will find is that thoughts, fears, frustrations, denigrations of other people, it's with our mouths that we devour. It's with our mouths that we cause great harm. With our words, we scrutinize and we criticize. And if we're honest about it, we can't help but stand with Isaiah and say, woe is me. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell with a people who are of unclean lips. We can't read this and we can't look honestly at who we are without quickly realizing that Isaiah's dilemma is the same as our own dilemma. And I would propose to you that coming to that awareness, the sooner we do, and the more honestly we do, and the more we return to that awareness of the dilemma that we have, is actually, by the power of the gospel, is actually wonderful news. Because if it's true that our dilemma is the same as Isaiah's dilemma, then the remedy that God gives to Isaiah is the same remedy that God gives to you and me in Jesus Christ. You know, who initiates? Who initiates in this passage? Isaiah's undone. He can't even help himself. But the initiative, God takes the initiative by his own free grace, and he triumphs over everything that separates Isaiah from his people. You see it. You see it through a sacrifice that leads to atonement, and you see it in atonement that leads to transformation. A sacrifice leads to atonement, and atonement leads to transformation. First, there's the sacrifice. Now, you have an altar. You see the seraphim touch it with a coal that comes from the altar. The altar was the place in the temple where sacrifice was made. So you would bring your sacrifice to the temple. Isaiah would have done this and seen this done many, many times. And another creature is sacrificed to pay for the guilt of the person who sacrificed it. The blood was, the animal was slit. It was an awful process. It was just ugly. And then the animal was burnt up in the altar. And so here what you have is the altar being the place of sacrifice, where it is also the place of forgiveness. It's the place where a relationship was restored. An Israelite could look at an altar in the temple and know through the atoning sacrifice that his sins were forgiven, and everything that divided him from a relationship with God was resolved by that sacrifice. And here you have a coal being taken from this altar where sacrifice happens and being brought by a seraphim to touch Isaiah's lips. And what does he say when he does it? It's profound. He says, verse 6, your guilt is taken away And your sin is what? Atoned for. You know that wonderful feeling? That wonderful feeling when you have reconciled with somebody that means the world to you. And maybe you got crosswise, or maybe you were estranged for some time and it hurt. And then true reconciliation happens, and everything that existed between you and that other person was put away fully and finally. There were apologies, there were forgiveness, and you were exhilarated by it. That is atonement. Atonement means that everything that existed, that separated you from the love, from the presence, from the very grace of the Father, was put away forever. A sacrifice was made that led to atonement. And where did atonement lead? Well, it led to transformation. Did you notice how it's like as soon as this happens, as soon as Isaiah, the coal touches Isaiah's lips, it's like the whole scene changes. I mean, it moves from something that's animated and graphic and real anxiety producing for Isaiah, and then all of a sudden it's like they're in a conversation with each other in verse 8. And God asks a question. He says, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Isaiah looks completely different when he says, I will go. I will go. Send me. The atoning work of God by his free grace produced an evident transformation in Isaiah. And he was no longer worried or afraid of being in the presence of God anymore. He was made right. His guilt was completely taken care of. And you might notice that there's no altar in this room. There's no altar in this room. There's no altar in any church I've ever been a part of. Why is there no altar in this room? Because a sacrifice was made. A sacrifice was made and never has to be offered again by Jesus Christ, who came for us, who bled and died for us, who climbed on the altar himself and sacrificed himself for us. The last sacrifice that ever has to be made. We don't have an altar. But you know what we do have? We have a table that reminds us of what Jesus has done for us and promises that there will come a time when we are enjoying God's presence face to face, finally, fully, and forever. Let's talk about the why and the how. Why? Well, we read about it earlier. Why? The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Isaiah will say this 3 chapters from now. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. You see a beautiful picture of God's zeal to reunite what was once broken, that he can heal what was broken and reunite what was separated. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. How? Unto us a child was born. See, when Jesus comes, what I want you to see is what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, Jesus, by the work of his cross, breaks down the dividing wall of hostility, and that by his cross, we now have peace with him and with each other. He reunites everything that was broken. And we long for that, don't we? We long for that kind of healing. This time of year, we long for that kind of healing. In 1989, the Berlin Wall had been standing for 28 years at this point. People thought it might never come down, but that didn't stop people from trying to cross it. And there are several hilarious stories about people that were trying to find their way from one end of the city to another. And one of my favorites was where a couple of families got together and used bed sheets to try and create a hot air balloon. And some people dug a tunnel. Other people tried to drive across. What I heard was that more than 5,000 people tried. Some made it. Many didn't. Some died. Until 1989, when there was a fluke in eastern An East German minister actually stood up at a press conference and said something he wasn't supposed to say, or said something unwisely. There were like preliminary discussions because of the restlessness and the protests of the people. He actually stood up and said that these borders are going to become open, and that's all the people needed to hear. And of course, it's famous now. They rushed at the wall. And they brought pickaxes, they brought hammers and crowbars and other rocks, did whatever they could to begin chipping away at that wall. That wall stood for 28 years. By 3 years later, it was virtually completely gone, overwhelmed by the zeal of these people. And one of the things I want you to see is that God overwhelms what divides us. God overwhelms the dividing wall of hostility. What? By his initiative, with his grace. It's the triumph of his grace over everything that separates you from him. Thanks be to God. Let me pray. O you who joins us to himself, I pray, asking for your love and your mercy to be evident to us yet again as we sing to you, as we prepare to come to your table. Thank you for coming to us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.